Of the approximately 282 destroyers the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned between 1922 and 1945, 227 were sunk before the war ended. That is a destruction rate of 80%. In any navy, in any war, in any period of naval history, no surface combatant type suffered losses at this rate. Not the German destroyers at Narvik, not the American destroyers in the Solomons. No destroyer force in the Second World War was consumed at the rate the Imperial Japanese Navy consumed its own. The men who served on those ships were not told this number. The Naval Ministry did not compile and distribute loss statistics to the crews of operational vessels. What the men on the destroyers knew, they learned from dockside reality, from the ships they watched depart their anchorages and not return, from the replacement ratings who arrived to fill billets left by men whose names they still knew and whose bunks they were now sleeping in. They performed their own arithmetic without official assistance, and they performed it with the accuracy that results when the evidence is direct and personal and arrives without the softening that institutional communication provides. 80%. In a force of 282 ships, this meant that the average Japanese destroyer sailor serving from December 1941 through August 1945 was statistically more likely to die in his ship than to survive the war in it. Not more likely to be killed in combat, more likely to die in his ship specifically in the sinking of the vessel he was currently assigned to. This is not a statement about the war's overall casualty mathematics for Japanese naval personnel. It is a statement about the specific physics of being inside a Japanese destroyer during the Pacific War. The men served anyway. What serving on those ships was like, in the daily physical terms that the Imperial Navy's institutional narrative had not described, and that the men themselves were institutionally prohibited from describing, is what this accounting attempts to provide. Begin with the specific class of ship that bore the heaviest operational burden of the destroyer force's most grueling period. The Fubuki class, commissioned between 1928 and 1933, represented at their introduction the most advanced destroyer design in the world. 24 ships in 3 subgroups. They were so superior to their contemporaries in armament, speed, and seakeeping that foreign naval observers initially refused to believe the specifications were accurate. They displaced approximately 2,090 tons at full load, measured approximately 118 meters from bow to stern, and carried 6 127mm guns in 3 twin mounts plus 9 torpedo tubes carrying the Type 93 Long Lance oxygen-propelled torpedo. Their 2 canpon boilers fed 2 shaft turbines developing 50,000 horsepower, producing a designed maximum speed of 38 knots. They were exceptional ships in 1928 when the first of them entered service. By 1942, they were aging combatants whose engineering plants had accumulated 14 years of service and whose structural condition reflected the accelerated maintenance pace that wartime operations imposed. The Fubuki-class ships that fought in the Solomons campaign from 1942 through 1943 were doing so in hulls that had been designed for a 20-year service life and that were now being operated at combat intensity in conditions the designers had not optimized for. This matters because the physical experience of serving on a Fubuki-class destroyer in the Solomons in 1942 was partly the experience of a class of ship that was showing its age in specific ways that affected the daily existence of the men who lived and worked in it. The forward crew berthing on a Fubuki-class destroyer occupied the bow sections of the hull below the main deck, a space that the ship's hydrodynamic characteristics made the most motion-prone location on the vessel. A Fubuki in a cross sea at 30 knots in the Solomon Sea was a ship whose bow rose and fell through a cycle that the men in the forward berthing spaces experienced as a continuous vertical oscillation, punctuated by the specific slamming impact that occurs when a destroyer bow comes down hard on the back face of a wave, rather than riding over it cleanly. The impact transmitted directly through the hull frames into the berthing space, into the bunks, into the bodies of the men attempting to sleep between watches. The hammock system was the sleeping arrangement. Each man was issued a hammock that he rigged to hooks on the overhead beams of the berthing space when sleeping and stowed during the day. The hammock system distributed the weight of a sleeping man across 2 attachment points, and theoretically allowed the man to remain stable regardless of the ship's motion by swinging with it rather than fighting it. In moderate weather, this worked. In the rough seas of the Solomons during the wet season, it produced a different geometry, where the hammock's swing amplified the ship's motion rather than absorbing it, swinging a sleeping man through arcs that kept him from achieving the depth of sleep that genuine rest required. The berthing space that housed 40 or 50 men in a space roughly the dimensions of a medium-sized apartment contained those men simultaneously in different states of waking. Because the watch system rotated men through 4-hour watch periods around the clock, the berthing space was never fully occupied in sleep and never empty. Men who had just completed the midnight watch came below to find men preparing for the 4 o'clock watch, and men coming off the 4 o'clock watch found men preparing for breakfast and the first working period of the day, and the continuous presence of men in various states of activity in a space where other men were trying to sleep produced the specific acoustic and social environment that characterized destroyer life below decks on every warship in every navy. On a Japanese destroyer, this environment had specific cultural characteristics that distinguished it from the equivalent spaces on American or British destroyers, and that are worth establishing because they shape the psychological texture of the service. The social hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy was expressed in the physical arrangement of the berthing spaces, with a thoroughness that the Navy's institutional philosophy required. Senior petty officers did not sleep in the same space as junior ratings. The men who had accumulated years of service and had risen through the rating structure to positions of authority over the junior men they now supervised occupied spaces that were marginally better than the spaces the junior men occupied, with a margin measured in the specific ways that small ships express hierarchy within limited volume. Slightly more space between hammocks, a location slightly further aft from the most violent motion of the bow, a position in the rotation for the head facilities that was marginally more convenient. The gap between officer and enlisted man was considerably more significant, and was expressed architecturally as well as socially. Officers on a Japanese destroyer had staterooms in the conventional sense, small private compartments with a bunk rather than a hammock, a small desk, and a door that closed. The captain had the equivalent of a sea cabin adjacent to the bridge. The executive officer and the division officers had shared or private staterooms depending on the ship's specific layout. These spaces were not luxurious. By any absolute standard, they were cramped and poorly ventilated and uncomfortable in the tropical heat that the Solomons campaign imposed on every ship operating in those waters. But they had doors. The door that closed was the specific form that privacy took in the Imperial Japanese Navy's destroyer force, and it was available exclusively to officers. The enlisted man's relationship with the concept of privacy was a relationship with its complete absence. Every function of physical existence occurred in the presence of other men, bathing in the communal washing facilities when the water allocation permitted bathing at all, managing bodily functions in the shared head facilities, whose capacity for the ship's complement was always marginally insufficient when demand was highest, which was after every watch change when between 40 and 60 men all required access at roughly the same time, changing clothing in the berthing space with other men dressing and undressing and sleeping and writing letters and playing cards within arm's reach in every direction. The cultural response to this absence of privacy was not the same culture that Western navies developed in similar conditions. American and British destroyer men developed a specific form of forced familiarity that acknowledged the shared circumstances and used humor and personal disclosure as management tools for the pressure the physical closeness created. The Japanese destroyer's response was different. The Imperial Navy's culture required a specific form of behavioral discipline in shared spaces that expressed itself as controlled restraint rather than familiarity. Men did not discuss personal matters in ways that would have been ordinary in a Western military mess. The institutional framework that governed interaction between men of different ranks extended even into the informal spaces of the berthing area in ways that maintained a degree of formality that the physical circumstances made simultaneously necessary and difficult. The heat was the constant condition against which every other condition of Solomon's service must be understood. The Fubuki-class destroyers were designed for operations in the waters around Japan, where the ambient sea and air temperatures were moderate by tropical standards. Their ventilation systems were adequate for temperate operations and inadequate for sustained tropical service. The Solomon Sea in the wet season had surface water temperatures between 28 and 32 degrees Celsius and ambient air temperatures between 30 and 35 degrees Celsius, with humidity consistently above 80%. The steel hull of a destroyer operating in these conditions absorbed heat from the water it sat in and from the air above it, and conducted that heat into the interior spaces with a thoroughness that steel's thermal conductivity ensures. The forward berthing spaces where the junior ratings slept registered temperatures between 32 and 38 degrees Celsius during normal operations in the Solomons. In the machinery spaces, the temperatures were considerably higher. The boiler rooms on a Fubuki-class destroyer at full combat power in tropical water routinely reached between 50 and 60 degrees Celsius. The engine rooms were marginally cooler, but not by margins that the men who worked in them found meaningful. A machinist's mate standing his boiler watch in a Fubuki fire room in the Solomons in 1942 was working in conditions that produced heat exhaustion in unacclimated men within 40 minutes, and that produced in acclimatized men a sustained reduction in cognitive and physical capacity that accumulated over the watch period and over the weeks and months of the deployment. The water allocation reflected the same priority hierarchy that governed every warship in the Pacific: engineering systems first, drinking water second, food preparation third, personal hygiene last. On a Fubuki-class destroyer, the distilling capacity was sized for the designed complement at the designed operational tempo. When the Guadalcanal supply runs extended the operational tempo beyond what the designed parameters assumed and reduced the port time available for taking on fresh water, the allocation for personal hygiene declined to the level that priority hierarchy placed it at when resources were constrained. Bathing with fresh water became a periodic privilege rather than a routine expectation. Men wiped down with damp cloths. They bathed when the opportunity presented itself in whatever form it presented itself, including going over the side into the sea when the ship was at anchor, in relatively safe waters, and the watch schedule permitted the brief interruption. The smell of 40 men in a destroyer's berthing space on the 14th day of a patrol that had allowed minimal fresh water access was a specific fact of life that the men aboard had stopped registering, and that anyone coming aboard from a period ashore noticed immediately and emphatically. The food in the early Solomons period maintained some of the quality that the Japanese Navy's provisioning standards specified. Rice was the caloric foundation, and rice kept well in the preserved quantities the destroyers carried. The supplemental provisions, including dried fish, pickled vegetables, and miso, were adequate for the first weeks of sustained operations. By 1943, the supply system that provided these provisions was beginning to show the strain that the American submarine campaign against Japanese supply shipping was imposing on every element of the Japanese logistics network. The destroyers that ran the Tokyo Express down the slot from Rabaul and Shortland Island to Guadalcanal were themselves the supply vessels for the island garrison, but their own provisions were declining in quality and quantity as the overall supply system contracted. By late 1943 and into 1944, men on Japanese destroyers in the Solomons and the approaches to New Guinea were eating meals that differed from the pre-war provisioning standard in ways that the men noticed and documented in letters and diaries when they could write at all. The rice was of lower grade, older, stored longer. The dried fish portions were smaller. The miso was thinner. The occasional fresh provisions that port calls had provided in better supplied periods were no longer arriving reliably. The men ate what was available because there was nothing else to eat, and because they were performing physical labor in tropical heat that demanded calories regardless of what the supply system was providing. The specific numbers that establish what daily life on a Japanese destroyer in the Solomons campaign actually cost in the most direct physical terms require examination here, because they reveal the gap between the Navy's institutional description of destroyer service and the documented operational reality with a precision that no general description achieves. Between August 1942 and February 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy conducted more than 300 destroyer sorties down the slot to supply the Guadalcanal garrison. The operational tempo this required meant that the destroyers assigned to the supply runs were at sea for between 15 and 22 days out of every 30 during the campaign's peak intensity. The watch rotation that 4 hours on, 8 hours off represents, in theory, produced in practice a sleep allocation that the operational demands reduced to between 3 and 4 hours per 24-hour period during the most intense periods. This figure is documented in the operational logs of the destroyer squadrons and in the fleet medical officer's reports to the 8th Fleet Command. Between 3 and 4 hours of sleep per 24 hours, for weeks. For men standing watches in 50-degree machinery spaces and navigating the slot at 30 knots in total darkness against American destroyers, PT boats, aircraft, and submarines simultaneously. The slot at night was the specific environment that took what the daily conditions had already extracted from the men and demanded more. The channel between the Central Solomon Islands ran for roughly 300 miles from the anchorage at Shortland Island in the north to Guadalcanal in the south. It was approximately 100 miles wide at its widest point and considerably narrower where the islands constricted the navigable water. A destroyer force running at 30 knots through the slot at night was traveling at approximately 35 kilometers per hour through waters that contained reefs, shoals, American submarines operating with increasing effectiveness, and PT boats that were specifically stationed to intercept the supply runs. The navigation required was precise and sustained. A single error in position fixing could put a destroyer onto a reef at 30 knots. The American destroyers that began intercepting the supply runs with radar-guided night attacks from late 1942 onward were invisible in the darkness until the moment they fired. The PT boats that operated in the shallower coastal waters were too small and too fast to be reliably detected by the lookouts on a destroyer's bridge until they were very close. The men on the bridge and the lookout positions during these runs maintained a sustained alertness that the sleep deficits of the preceding days had already significantly degraded. The specific engagement that most clearly illustrates what the slot's tactical environment demanded of the men who operated in it is the action off Tassafaronga on November 30th, 1942. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka's destroyer force of 8 ships was running a supply mission to Guadalcanal when it was intercepted by an American cruiser and destroyer force under Rear Admiral Carlton Wright. The American force had radar. The Japanese did not, or had radar insufficient to locate the American formation before the attack developed. Wright's cruisers opened fire at approximately 10 minutes after 11 in the evening. The American attack was initially effective, hitting the Japanese destroyer Takanami and bringing her to a stop in the slot. What happened next is why the Battle of Tassafaronga is remembered by naval historians as one of the most stunning reversal of fortune engagements of the Pacific War. Tanaka's destroyer crews, under fire, in the dark, with their formation disrupted, with one ship already stopped and burning, launched torpedo attacks that struck 4 American heavy cruisers. Northampton sank. Minneapolis, New Orleans, and Pensacola were so severely damaged that all 3 required months of repair. Tanaka lost 1 destroyer. The exchange was tactical genius of a specific kind that required not strategic planning, but the disciplined instant execution of trained men performing under extreme pressure in conditions of fire and confusion. The men who fired those torpedoes in the dark were doing it in the 3rd week of sustained operations with insufficient sleep. They were doing it in conditions where the visual environment contained nothing that resembled what training exercises had used as reference points. They were doing it under fire from cruisers whose shells were landing close enough to the deck to kill, and they executed with sufficient precision to hit 4 targets that were maneuvering at high speed in the dark. This was what the Imperial Navy's destroyer training produced. It was also the last campaign in which that training could express its full quality, because the men who trained to this standard were dying in the slot at a rate that the training pipeline could not replace. Between Tassafaronga in November 1942 and the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, the destroyer force that had demonstrated its capabilities at Tassafaronga lost additional ships to American air attack, surface action, and submarine torpedo. Each ship that went down took its experienced crew with it. The replacements who filled the billets of those experienced men came from training that had been abbreviated by the operational demands that were simultaneously consuming the force the training was supposed to maintain. The specific experience of being on a Japanese destroyer that was sinking in the slot has been documented through the accounts of the men who survived these sinkings and who gave testimony to historians in the decades after the war. Petty Officer Second Class. Hideo Mori served on the Fubuki-class destroyer Fubuki herself, the named ship of the class, during the Battle of Cape Esperance on October 11th and 12th, 1942. Fubuki was sunk by gunfire from American cruisers during that engagement. She went down in approximately 3 minutes. Mori was in the engine room when the American shells began striking the ship. He described in a 1975 interview with a Japanese naval history researcher the specific sequence of events as he experienced them from that position. The first hits registered as concussive jolts through the hull, with no visual information attached, simply the sudden shock and the change in the ship's motion. The lights failed. Emergency lighting came on in red, dim enough to see but not enough to read the instruments clearly. Water began entering the engine room from a damaged section of the hull. He and the other engine room watchstanders began the damage control procedures they had drilled for this scenario. They did not complete them. The ship rolled and they went into the water. He was in the Solomon Sea for approximately 40 minutes before a Japanese destroyer recovered him. He was 24 years old. He described the water as warm and the darkness as complete, and the sounds around him in the water as the sounds of other men, some of them alive and calling out, and the gradual reduction in the number of voices over the 40 minutes as the men who were wounded or exhausted, or simply unable to stay afloat, stopped calling out, and the water that had been full of voices became quieter. He was assigned to another destroyer within 2 weeks. He was still in destroyer service when that destroyer was sunk in 1944. He survived that sinking as well. He went back to Japan after the second sinking and was assigned to shore duty for the remainder of the war. He returned to his home prefecture of Niigata after the war and fished for 31 years in the waters of the Sea of Japan. He described the Sea of Japan in the 1975 interview as very different from the slot in temperature and color, and in the specific quality of the silence above the water. He said the slot had a quality of sound above it that the Sea of Japan did not have. He said he had never entirely resolved in his own understanding what that difference was or what produced it. He said he thought it might simply be the difference between a place where many men had died and a place where fewer men had died, and that the many deaths left something in the air above the water that the water itself did not record, but that a person who had been there could still detect. The interviewer asked him if he went back to the slot after the war. He said he had not. He said there was nothing there he needed to verify. He said he knew what was there. After Guadalcanal, as the campaign moved north and the American material superiority became increasingly decisive in every engagement, the Japanese destroyer force continued performing the same missions it had performed in the Solomons under conditions that progressively less resembled those for which it had been designed and trained. The supply runs became more dangerous as American air cover extended northward. The escort missions for the remaining capital ships became more desperate. As American carrier forces stripped the fleet of the ships the destroyers were supposed to escort, the anti-submarine operations against the growing American submarine force became increasingly futile as the American submarines operated with increasing sophistication, and the destroyers' detection equipment fell further behind. By 1944 and into 1945, the men on Japanese destroyers were performing missions that the remaining officers understood offered very limited survival probability, and that the enlisted men understood through the same arithmetic they had been performing since 1942 in the absence of official statistics. The ships were being sunk at the rate of between 2 and 4 per month. The replacements were less experienced. The fuel was becoming scarcer as the American submarine campaign against Japanese tanker traffic intensified. Destroyers that completed their assigned missions sometimes returned to base with fuel states that reflected not the mission's planned consumption, but the minimum required to reach port, leaving no margin for the evasive maneuvering that survival in increasingly contested waters required. The men stood their watches in these conditions because the ship required it and the service required it, and the cultural framework within which they served had not provided them with any category for considering alternatives. One of those men who stood his watch to the end was Seaman First Class Keisuke Yamamoto of the destroyer Hatsuyuki, a Fubuki-class ship that had been commissioned in 1929 and that was operating in the waters around the Philippines in 1944 as one of the older surviving members of the class that had once been the most advanced destroyer design afloat. Yamamoto was 19 years old when he was assigned to Hatsuyuki in the spring of 1944. He was from Hiroshima Prefecture and had volunteered for naval service in 1943 with the specific intention of serving on destroyers, which the recruiting materials had described as the most active and demanding service available to an enlisted man who wanted to see the war rather than wait for it. He was seeing the war. Hatsuyuki was assigned to the escort of the Manila supply convoys through the summer of 1944, convoys that the American submarine force and the growing American carrier air power were attacking with increasing frequency and increasing effectiveness. Of the ships in the first convoy Yamamoto made with Hatsuyuki, 2 of the 7 transports were sunk by the time the convoy reached its destination. Of the escort vessels, Hatsuyuki survived the entire operation without damage, but the destroyer Nowaki, running in the same formation, was damaged by aerial attack and required weeks of repair. Yamamoto kept a brief diary through the summer of 1944, a practice that was technically prohibited under naval regulations, but that was widespread among enlisted men, and that the officers generally chose not to enforce because the regulation existed to prevent security compromising information from being recorded, and a rating's personal observations about the heat and the food and the noise of the engine room did not reach the threshold of security concern that justified enforcement. His diary was among his personal effects when Hatsuyuki was sunk by American submarine torpedo in October 1944 in the Philippine Sea. The submarine identified in post-war records as responsible for Hatsuyuki's sinking was USS Sea Dragon. Hatsuyuki sank in approximately 7 minutes. Of her crew of approximately 208 men, 43 were rescued by accompanying vessels. Yamamoto was 19 years old. He had been in destroyer service for approximately 8 months. He did not survive the sinking. His family in Hiroshima received the notification that he was missing in action in late October 1944 and received no further notification during the war because no further information was available. He was listed as missing. The ship was gone. The water where the ship had been did not distinguish between the men who had died in the explosion and the men who had drowned, and the men who had been recovered, and the men who had simply not been found. The missing category in the casualty records contains all of these possibilities without resolving them. His mother kept his last letter, written from Cavite Naval Station in the Philippines in September 1944, in which he described the heat and said the food was adequate and said he was not afraid, and said she should not worry about him because the ship had a good captain and the crew knew what they were doing. He asked her to tell his younger brother that he was sorry he had not been able to write more often. She kept the letter for the rest of her life. His younger brother read it for the first time in 1961, when he was old enough for the reading to mean what it actually meant, rather than what a child's reading of it would have produced. He described reading it in an account written for a Hiroshima Prefectural Memorial Project in 1995 as the experience of meeting someone for the first time who had been in his family his entire life and whom he had never actually known. He said the letter told him what his brother had found worth saying with whatever time he had to write. He said it was a list of things that did not alarm: the heat, the food, the captain, the crew. He said his brother had known when he wrote it that there were other things he could have said and had chosen not to say them so that their mother would not worry. He said he thought about that choice for the rest of his life. Did anyone in your family serve on a Japanese destroyer or any warship during the Second World War? Drop their name in the comments. Let's make sure they are remembered.